Huelva, Spain, April 1943. Spanish fishermen found him at dawn, eyes wide open beneath 3 feet of salt water, still clutching secrets that could change the war. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale where death becomes the perfect spy. Some lies are so necessary, they refuse to die with the men who carry them. Operation Mincemeat had been Britain's most audacious wartime deception. In April 1943, British intelligence planted the corpse of a homeless Welsh vagrant, transformed into Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, off the Spanish coast near Huelva. The body carried fabricated documents designed to convince Nazi Germany that the Allied invasion would target Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The 20 Committee had orchestrated every detail, from love letters to bank statements, creating a complete fictional identity for a man who had died from rat poison in London. The operation succeeded beyond all expectations. German intelligence intercepted the documents, and Hitler himself redirected troops away from Sicily. Thousands of Allied lives were saved when the real invasion commenced. Lieutenant Isaac Holloway knew none of this would comfort him tonight. He sat in his cramped quarters at the Gibraltar intelligence station, staring at the classified addendum that had arrived that morning, stamped with blood-red ink. Eyes only, immediate discontinuation. The report contained 3 lines that had been eating at him for hours. Spanish mortuary worker Miguel Santos had disappeared from his post in Huelva. A local fisherman claimed he witnessed a figure in British uniform walking along the shoreline at midnight, leaving wet footprints that led inland before vanishing. Most disturbing of all, the grave of Major William Martin had been found empty during a routine security check. Isaac had volunteered for this assignment, thinking it would be cleaner than the North African theater. No artillery, no machine gun nests, no bodies rotting in the desert sun. Just paperwork and confirmation that their deception had worked. He was supposed to monitor German communications, verify document interception, and file reports. Simple intelligence work for a war-weary lieutenant who had seen enough real combat. But the nightmares had started 3 nights ago. Always the same dream, standing waist, deep in dark water, while a pale figure approached from the depths. The figure wore a British uniform, carried a briefcase chained to its wrist, and spoke in a voice like drowning. I was nobody, it would say, water streaming from its mouth. But you made me somebody. Now I cannot rest. Isaac would wake gasping, his uniform soaked with sweat that smelled inexplicably of brine. The worst part was the recognition. He had seen Major Martin's face during the preparation phase in London, had helped verify the authenticity of the personal effects. The face in his dreams was unmistakably the same, but animated with an intelligence that had never existed in life. The dead man's eyes held knowledge, purpose, and something that looked disturbingly like gratitude. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Corporal Davies entered with another dispatch, his face pale in the lamplight. Sir, there's been another incident in Huelva. Local authorities are requesting British liaison. Davies hesitated before continuing. They found wet footprints leading from the cemetery to the town square. The prints match British military boots, size 9, same as Major Martin's service record. Isaac felt his hands begin to shake as he reached for the dispatch. The paper was damp, though Davies had just brought it from the communications room. When he looked up, the corporal was gone, but the smell of salt water lingered in the air. If Isaac's first glimpse into the impossible has your pulse racing, subscribe now, because what he discovers next in Huelva will shatter everything he thought he knew about the operation. Isaac arrived in Huelva the next morning, his nerves frayed from another sleepless night. The Spanish coastal town bustled with fishing boats and merchants, but underneath the normalcy lay an undercurrent of unease that seemed to follow him through the narrow streets. Local Spanish authorities had been cooperative during the original operation, and now they needed that cooperation again to contain whatever was happening. The cemetery sat on a hill, overlooking the Mediterranean, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the harsh morning sun. Father Rodriguez, the local priest, met Isaac at the gates. The man's hands trembled as he lit another cigarette, his third since Isaac's arrival 5 minutes earlier. It started the night after the burial, Rodriguez explained, his English heavily accented but precise. The groundskeeper heard digging sounds. When he investigated, he found the grave disturbed but not opened, just scratched at, like someone was trying to claw their way out from inside. Isaac followed the priest to a modest grave, marked with a simple wooden cross bearing the name William Martin. The earth around it looked wrong, churned and dark, despite the lack of recent rain. More disturbing were the footprints leading away from the grave, each one filled with seawater that hadn't evaporated despite the Mediterranean heat. The mortuary worker, Miguel Santos, Isaac prompted. When did he disappear? Rodriguez crossed himself before answering. 3 days ago. His wife found his clothes folded neatly on the beach, but Miguel was gone. The strange thing is, his clothes were dry, but they smelled of death. Not the sea, senor. Death. Isaac knelt beside the grave and immediately recoiled. The soil was ice cold, so cold that frost had formed around the edges despite the warm weather. When he touched the earth, his fingers came away wet and smelling of brine and something else, something organic and putrid. Has anyone else seen him? The figure in the British uniform? The priest nodded reluctantly. Old Carmen, the fishmonger. She saw him standing at the end of the pier last night, staring out at the water. She said he was perfectly still for an hour, water dripping from his uniform, briefcase in his hand. When she blinked, he was gone, but the pier was flooded with seawater. Isaac felt his chest tighten. The briefcase detail hadn't been released to local authorities. Only British intelligence knew about the chained briefcase, which meant either Rodriguez was lying or Major Martin was somehow carrying the knowledge he'd died with. That afternoon, Isaac interviewed Carmen herself. The elderly woman's eyes darted constantly toward the harbor as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He was beautiful and terrible, she said in broken English, like an angel of death. His skin was white as sea foam, and his eyes. Dios mío, his eyes were the color of deep water. When he turned to look at me, I saw myself drowning in them. Isaac left Carmen's shop with his hands shaking. The descriptions were too specific, too consistent. Either the entire town was experiencing the same mass hallucination, or something wearing Major Martin's face was walking among them. He returned to his hotel as the sun set, only to find a manila envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a photograph that made his blood freeze. It showed Major Martin's grave, but the image had been taken from inside the coffin, looking up through 6 feet of earth toward a starlit sky. At the bottom of the photograph, written in water-stained ink, were 5 words. I remember who I was. Isaac stared at the photograph until his vision blurred. The handwriting matched the samples from Major Martin's fabricated personal effects, the same handwriting that British intelligence had forged to create a dead man's identity. But this message had been written after burial, after decomposition should have made writing impossible. He turned the photograph over and found one more line, written in the same careful script, "Find me where the tide meets the truth." Outside his window, the Mediterranean waves crashed against the harbor walls with unusual violence, and Isaac could swear he heard something calling his name from the depths. Isaac couldn't wait for backup or authorization. The photograph burned in his pocket like a curse, and sleep had become impossible. At 11:45 that night, he walked through Huelva's empty streets toward the harbor, following the cryptic message that had been written by a dead man's hand. The town felt different in darkness. Shadows moved wrong between the buildings, and every footstep echoed with the sound of water dripping on stone. Street lamps flickered as he passed, casting his reflection in shop windows where it lingered too long, as if reluctant to follow him. The pier stretched into the Mediterranean like a concrete finger pointing toward oblivion. Isaac's boots clicked against the wet planks, though he couldn't remember when the wood had become soaked. Each step left him deeper in water that seemed to rise from nowhere, until he was walking through ankle-deep brine that tasted of salt and decay. At the pier's end, where Carmen claimed to have seen the figure, Isaac found more than footprints. Personal effects were arranged in a precise line: a waterlogged wallet, theater ticket stubs from London's West End, and a photograph of a woman named Pam. The same items that British intelligence had planted on Major Martin's corpse to make him believable. But these weren't reproductions. Isaac recognized the specific water damage, the way the ink had run on Pam's photograph. These were the actual items that had been buried with the body, somehow transported from 6 feet underground to this pier. "You came." The voice emerged from the water itself, bubbling up through the planks beneath Isaac's feet. "I wondered if you would have the courage." Isaac spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The pier behind him had vanished into fog that smelled of morgues and ocean depths. When he turned back toward the sea, Major William Martin stood 20 feet away, water streaming from his Royal Marine uniform. The dead man looked exactly as he had during preparation in London, but animated with terrible purpose. His skin held the pale luminescence of deep-sea creatures, and his eyes reflected starlight like pools of black water. The briefcase remained chained to his wrist, but now it pulsed with its own rhythm like a mechanical heart. "You helped create me," Martin said, his voice carrying the hollow echo of drowned men. "Gave me a name, a purpose, a woman to love. You made me more real in death than Glinda Michael ever was in life." Isaac tried to speak, but found his throat constricted with terror. Martin stepped closer, each footfall splashing seawater onto the pier, though his feet never touched the planks. "The operation succeeded beyond your wildest hopes," Martin continued. "Hitler moved his divisions. Sicily fell. Thousands of lives were saved. But you never asked what I wanted, did you? What happens to a man who dies as nobody and awakens as somebody else?" The briefcase began to open on its own, revealing documents that glowed with phosphorescent light. Isaac glimpsed battle plans, troop movements, and strategic assessments, but the text kept changing, rewriting itself in languages he didn't recognize. "I remember everything now," Martin whispered. "Glinder's death, the morgue, the transformation, being dressed in another man's uniform and given another man's love letters. Do you know what it's like to wake up underwater with memories that aren't your own?" Isaac finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "What do you want?" Martin's smile revealed teeth like broken shells. "I want to finish my mission, but first I need you to understand what you've done. What happens when you give a corpse a soul?" The fog rolled in completely, swallowing the pier, the town, and the stars. Isaac was alone with the dead man in a world made of salt water and regret, about to learn the true cost of the perfect deception. Isaac awoke on the beach at dawn, his uniform soaked and caked with sand. The pier stretched behind him exactly as it always had, no signs of flooding or supernatural encounters. But clutched in his right hand was Pam's photograph, waterlogged and real, with Major Martin's handwriting on the back. "She never existed, but I loved her anyway." The walk back to his hotel felt like swimming through thick air. Every reflection showed Martin walking beside him, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always watching with those deep water eyes. Other people passed without seeing the dead man, but Isaac could smell the morgue scent that followed in his wake. Back in his room, Isaac found his typewriter had been used. A single sheet of paper sat in the roller, containing a message he didn't remember writing. "The cemetery. Tonight, bring a shovel. Learn what you buried." His hands shook as he read the words, typed in his own style, but carrying someone else's thoughts. The T stuck slightly, just as it did on his personal machine, but Isaac was certain he'd been unconscious on the beach all night, unless sleepwalking had become part of his deteriorating mental state. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Isaac tried calling his superior officer in Gibraltar, but the line went dead every time he mentioned Major Martin's name. He attempted to file a report, but his typewriter would only produce the same message, over and over. Bring a shovel, learn what you buried. By evening, Isaac's resolve had crumbled. He borrowed a spade from the hotel groundskeeper and made his way to the cemetery, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain or resist. The Spanish authorities had posted no guards, as if they'd collectively decided to forget the grave existed. Father Rodriguez waited at the cemetery gates, his face pale in the moonlight. "I've been expecting you," he said quietly. "He told me you would come." "Who told you?" "The man who smells like death. He visits my confessional every night now, trying to remember what sins belong to whom." Rodriguez handed Isaac a rusted crowbar. "He wants you to understand what really happened here." The walk to Martin's grave felt endless. Each step brought the smell of decomposition stronger, until Isaac was breathing through his mouth to avoid retching. The headstone seemed to pulse in the darkness, and the ground around it had turned black and oily. Isaac began to dig. The first shovelful of earth came up wet and wrong, crawling with pale worms that shouldn't exist in Spanish soil. The second revealed fragments of British uniform, but not the one Martin had been buried in. These scraps were older, stained with something darker than seawater. "Deeper," came Martin's voice from everywhere and nowhere. "Find what they didn't tell you." Isaac dug frantically now, possessed by the need to reach the bottom of this terrible truth. 3 feet down, his shovel struck wood. But when he cleared the dirt away, he found not one coffin but 2, stacked atop each other like a macabre sandwich. The upper coffin was empty, its lid thrown back, and its satin lining torn as if clawed from within. But the lower coffin contained horrors that made Isaac's sanity reel. Inside lay the decomposed remains of a British soldier, but his uniform bore different insignia. Major Charles Somerset, according to the dog tags. And beneath him, another body, then another. Isaac counted 7 corpses before his nerve broke. 7 British soldiers, all bearing different names, all wearing Royal Marine uniforms, all carrying identical briefcases chained to their wrists. Operation Mincemeat hadn't been the first deception of its kind. It had been the 8th. "Now you see," Martin's voice whispered from the mass grave, "how many men died to make one lie believable. How many souls were sacrificed for your perfect deception." Isaac scrambled backward as pale hands began emerging from the pile of corpses, all reaching toward him with desperate hunger. Isaac ran until his lungs burned, but he couldn't escape the sound of soil falling back into the grave behind him. When he finally stopped, gasping in an alley between 2 fishermen's houses, he realized the pale hands had followed him. They emerged from storm drains, from shadows between buildings, from the cracks in cobblestone streets. 7 sets of reaching fingers, all wearing different military rings, all grasping for something they would never find. He stumbled back to his hotel room and immediately began packing. Whatever Operation Mincemeat had become, whatever horror British intelligence had unleashed through repeated deceptions, Isaac wanted no part of it. But when he opened his suitcase, he found it already packed with items that weren't his. 7 suicide notes, each written in different handwriting, each signed with a different name. Glindra Michael, Thomas Wright, Harold Peterson. The names of homeless men, vagrants, forgotten souls who had died alone in London's streets and morgues. Men whose deaths had been considered convenient rather than tragic. Men whose bodies had been transformed into instruments of war. Isaac's hands trembled as he read the final note, written in Glindra Michael's careful script. "I hope my death serves some purpose, as my life never did. But I pray whoever finds this remembers that I was a man first, not a tool." A knock at his door interrupted his reading. Isaac opened it to find Father Rodriguez, but the priest's eyes had changed. They held the same deep-water quality as Major Martin's, and when he spoke, his voice carried the echo of drowned confessions. "He wants to see you." Rodriguez said. "In the church. He has something to show you." Isaac had no choice but to follow. His legs moved without his permission, carrying him through Huelva's twisting streets toward the old stone church that overlooked the harbor. The building felt wrong as they approached, its walls weeping condensation that smelled of formaldehyde and regret. Inside, candles flickered with phosphorescent light, and the air hung thick with the weight of accumulated secrets. Major Martin stood before the altar, but he was no longer alone. 6 other figures in British uniforms flanked him, their faces bearing the telltale signs of morgue preparation and decay. "Welcome to our congregation," Martin said, his voice harmonizing with 6 others in a chorus of the discarded dead. "We've been waiting for someone from the living world to witness our testimony." The briefcase chained to Martin's wrist began to glow again, and this time Isaac could read the documents inside. They weren't battle plans or troop movements. They were transfer orders, morgue receipts, and burial authorizations. The complete paper trail of Operation Mincemeat and its 7 predecessors, each documenting how the British intelligence services had systematically harvested the homeless dead for strategic deceptions. "Do you see now?" Martin stepped closer, and Isaac could smell the chemical preservatives that still clung to his uniform. "We were nobody when we lived, disposable, forgotten. But in death we became somebody. We had names, ranks, loved ones. We had purpose." The other 6 figures moved closer, surrounding Isaac in a circle of animated corpses. Each carried their own briefcase. Each bore the scars of hasty embalming and rushed preparation. "The operation succeeded," continued the figure who had once been Thomas Wright. "Sicily fell. Thousands lived. But what of us? What of the men who gave their deaths for your victory?" Isaac tried to speak but found his throat closed with terror and guilt. These weren't monsters or demons. They were victims demanding recognition, forgotten souls who had been denied even the dignity of their own deaths. "We want what was promised," Martin whispered. "We want to exist. We want our lives to have meant something beyond deception." The church bells began to toll midnight, but each chime sounded like falling earth, like coffin lids closing, like the final breath of forgotten men. Isaac's voice returned in a broken whisper. "What do you want from me?" Major Martin smiled, with lips that had never learned how to form that expression in life. "We want you to choose, Lieutenant Holloway. Will you be the one who finally tells our story, or will you become the next man who never was?" The 7 corpses began to move in perfect synchronization, their decomposing fingers working at the chains that bound their briefcases. One by one, the cases fell open, revealing not documents but mirrors, each reflecting a different version of Isaac's face. In one reflection, he was drowning. In another, he was already dead. In the third, he was typing a report that would bury this incident forever. "Your superiors already know you're compromised," said Thomas Wright, his voice carrying the wet sound of lungs filled with embalming fluid. "They've prepared your replacement. A convenient accident during field operations. Another young officer who asked too many questions." Isaac's legs gave out, and he collapsed into a pew that felt like sitting on a gravestone. The wood was ice cold and damp with condensation that formed words and languages he couldn't read. Around him, the church filled with the sound of typing, as if invisible stenographers were recording every word for some final judgment. "Look at your hands," Martin commanded. Isaac raised his trembling hands and screamed. His fingers were pale and bloated, like they'd been underwater for weeks. His military ring had tarnished black, and beneath his fingernails was the dark soil from 7 different graves. When he touched his face, his skin felt cold and waxy, like morgue preparation. "The transformation has already begun," whispered Harold Peterson, the 3rd man to die for British deception. "You've breathed our air, touched our earth, carried our secrets. You're becoming one of us." The church began to fill with water, seeping up through the floorboards like a rising tide of tears and preservation fluid. Isaac tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond. His uniform was soaking through, and with each breath, the taste of formaldehyde grew stronger on his tongue. "There is another way," Martin said, extending his hand toward Isaac. "Write our story. Tell the world what happened to the men who never were. Give us the recognition we were denied in life." Isaac looked at the offered hand and saw not decomposition, but hope. These weren't monsters seeking revenge. They were forgotten souls who had been denied even the dignity of their own deaths, transformed into tools of war without consent or acknowledgement. "If I write your story," Isaac gasped through the rising water, "what happens to me?" "You become the chronicler of the dead," Martin replied. "You carry our memories, our names, our humanity, but you live to tell it." The water reached Isaac's chest now, and he could feel his heartbeat slowing to match the rhythm of the 7 dead men. In the distance, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles, British intelligence officers coming to collect their compromised asset. Isaac reached for Martin's cold hand, and the moment their fingers touched, he felt 7 lifetimes of loneliness and abandonment flood through him. Glindra Michael's desperation, Thomas Wright's final prayers, Harold Peterson's regret, all of them died unnamed and unwanted, only to be given false identities in death. "I'll write your story," Isaac whispered as the water reached his neck. "I'll make sure the world knows you were men first." Martin nodded, and for the first time, his smile looked genuinely peaceful. "Then wake up, Lieutenant. Wake up and remember us." The church dissolved around Isaac like morning mist, but the weight of 7 dead men's memories remained pressed against his heart like stones. Isaac awoke in a military hospital in Gibraltar, his body strapped to a bed, and his mind fog-wrapped with sedatives. Colonel Morrison sat beside him, reading from a medical chart with practiced indifference. The official story was already written. Lieutenant Holloway had suffered a severe nervous breakdown during routine intelligence operations in Spain. Hallucinations, paranoid delusions, acute stress reaction. "You've been unconscious for 3 days, Morrison said without looking up. "The doctors say you were found wandering the Huelva cemetery at dawn, covered in grave dirt and speaking to empty air. Tragic case of battlefield fatigue, catching up with a promising young officer." Isaac tried to speak, but his throat felt raw, as if he'd been screaming for hours. When he finally managed words, they came out as a whisper. "The graves, the 7 men, they were real." Morrison's expression didn't change. "There was only one grave, Lieutenant. Major William Martin, deceased Royal Marine, buried with full military honors after serving his final mission for king and country, a hero's grave, properly maintained by Spanish authorities." But Isaac could see the lie in the colonel's eyes, could smell the faint scent of formaldehyde that clung to the man's uniform. Morrison knew. They all knew. Operation Mincemeat hadn't been an isolated deception, but part of a systematic program that treated human corpses like military equipment. "You're being transferred to a psychiatric facility in Scotland," Morrison continued. "Excellent care, complete discretion. After appropriate treatment, you'll be discharged with a full pension and a commendation for services to the Crown. All records of this incident will be classified indefinitely." Isaac nodded weakly, but his fingers were already moving beneath the hospital sheets, tracing words in the air. 7 names, 7 stories, 7 forgotten souls who had trusted him to be their witness. The memories pressed against his consciousness like physical weight, demanding recognition. 3 weeks later, Isaac sat in his small cottage in the Scottish Highlands, officially invalided out of service due to psychological trauma. His neighbors thought him a harmless eccentric. The local doctor prescribed rest and fresh air, and British intelligence monitored him from a discreet distance. But every night, Isaac wrote. He wrote about Glindra Michael, the homeless Welshman who died from rat poison and became Major William Martin. He wrote about Thomas Wright, Harold Peterson, and 4 other nameless men whose bodies had served the Crown in death, as their lives never could, in service to anything. He wrote about briefcases chained to corpses, about false love letters and fabricated identities, about the systematic harvesting of society's forgotten dead. The manuscript grew longer each night, fed by memories that weren't entirely his own. Sometimes Isaac would find pages he didn't remember writing, filled with details about morgue procedures and embalming techniques he'd never learned. Other times, he would discover suicide notes written in handwriting that changed from page to page, each bearing the signature of a different dead man. His publishers rejected the manuscript as fiction too disturbing for public consumption. Military historians dismissed it as the paranoid fantasies of a shell-shocked veteran. Government censors ensured that certain details never reached print, and Isaac's credibility was quietly destroyed through whisper campaigns about his mental instability. But Isaac continued writing, driven by the weight of 7 dead men's trust. He wrote until his fingers bled, until his eyes burned, until his neighbors began to whisper about the strange lights that flickered in his windows at all hours of the night. On a cold November morning in 1954, they found Isaac's body at his writing desk, slumped over his typewriter with a peaceful expression on his face. The final page in the machine contained only 7 words, typed over and over until the keys had worn through the paper. He was nobody. He was me. Remember. The cottage was searched thoroughly, but no manuscript was ever found. The official cause of death was heart failure, brought on by chronic stress and alcohol abuse. Isaac Holloway was buried in an unmarked grave in the local cemetery, just another forgotten casualty of war. But on quiet nights in Huelva, fishermen still report seeing 8 figures walking along the pier in British uniforms, each carrying a briefcase, each searching for someone willing to hear their story. The 8th figure is younger than the others, with lieutenant stripes and eyes that hold the weight of terrible knowledge. They say he's still writing their story, somewhere between the living and the dead, waiting for someone brave enough to remember the men who never were. If this tale from the War Maestro archive left you questioning what's real and what's deception, then you're ready to join our intelligence network. Check your reflection in dark water. Make sure you're still alone. And subscribe to decode more classified horrors from military history. Hit that notification bell so you'll know when another forgotten file surfaces from the depths. Share this story with fellow seekers of military mysteries who understand that the most terrifying operations are the ones that officially never happen. Remember, some briefcases are still chained to wrists that shouldn't exist.